Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a moment in every man's life when the silence of a woman he once took for granted becomes louder than every conversation they ever had. It's the kind of silence that rattles his confidence, exposes his patterns, and forces him to confront the truth he's been avoiding. When you go quiet, not out of anger, but out of self-respect, it triggers something in him he never expected. Because your silence isn't empty, it's a mirror. And day by day, he's about to realize exactly what that reflection reveals. When you go silent, something powerful begins to happen inside his mind, even if he tries to pretend otherwise. At first, he experiences what feels like a shift in the atmosphere. He's used to your presence, your energy, your responses, the comfort of knowing you're just a message away. When that suddenly disappears, it unsettles him. Not because he's entitled to your attention, but because your absence creates a contrast he can't ignore. He notices the space you once filled, and that space becomes louder than any words you could have spoken. On the first day, he tells himself he's fine. He brushes it off. He convinces himself you're just busy, or that he doesn't need to think about it. But even in that state of denial, there's a small flicker of curiosity growing inside him. He wonders what you're doing, who you're talking to, what shifted in the dynamic. He scrolls through your last messages, trying to see if he missed something, some clue that explains your sudden quiet. And even if he stops himself from reaching out, he's now aware of an imbalance he didn't feel before. He's aware that the rhythm he took for granted is no longer guaranteed. By the second day, that curiosity evolves into a check of his own ego. He starts questioning why your silence bothers him. He wonders if it's because he's losing a sense of control, or because he realizes he liked the attention more than he admitted. He begins to see how much of his confidence was built on the assumption that you would always be there, always responding, always giving. This is when the cracks begin to show. Cracks he didn't even know existed. Your silence forces him to confront a version of himself he rarely acknowledges, the version that cares more than he pretends. By the third day, something deeper starts to settle in. He begins noticing small things that remind him of you. A phrase, a song, a time of day. Normally these reminders would blend into the background, but now they hit differently because there's no immediate way to reconnect. This creates a sense of longing he didn't expect, and in that longing he starts to replay everything you said, everything he may have dismissed, every moment he overlooked. Silence has a way of amplifying what was once ignored. It makes him aware of the value you brought, not through intensity, but through consistency. As more days pass, the silence begins to challenge him. It makes him think about his own behavior in ways he usually avoids. He wonders whether he gave you enough, whether he showed enough appreciation, whether he took more than he offered. For the first time, he feels the consequences of not giving effort, not because you punished him, but because you withdrew your energy without making a dramatic exit. That quiet withdrawal forces him to see the difference between who he thought he was and who he actually showed up as. It pushes him into a level of emotional awareness he didn't ask for, but now can't escape. By this point, he starts to think about what he should have done. He thinks about the messages he should have sent, the calls he could have made, the effort he should have shown. He begins to realize how differently things could have looked if he had matched your presence with his own. Regret begins to mix with reflection, and he finds himself revisiting choices he once dismissed as insignificant. It's in this state that he begins to understand your worth, not because you explained it, but because you removed access to it. Then comes the shift he didn't expect. He starts thinking about you not just in terms of what you gave him, but in terms of the peace you brought into your own life by stepping back. He begins to see that your silence isn't a game. It's growth. It's alignment. It's you choosing yourself instead of waiting for him to choose you. And that realization stings. Not because it hurts his pride, but because it reveals something he didn't want to admit. You weren't the one who needed him. He was the one benefiting from your presence. Your silence also makes him aware of something else, something subtle but significant. It makes him see that you don't beg for attention. You don't chase what doesn't value you. You don't cling to something uncertain. Your withdrawal comes from strength, not weakness, and that strength forces him to rethink the dynamic entirely. He begins to realize that the version of you he interacted with before wasn't even your fullest version. It was just the version that cared, the version that shows up, the version that tries. And now he begins to wonder what the version of you looks like that doesn't try anymore. As more days pass, he feels a shift from curiosity to concern. He wonders whether he lost something he didn't know he needed. He wonders whether someone else stepped into the space he didn't appreciate. He wonders whether you finally saw your own value so clearly that his inconsistency no longer affected you. And that possibility is what truly wakes him up. Because for the first time, he has to confront the idea that you might actually move forward, fully, confidently, without looking back. And that realization triggers the deepest thought of all. What if you were the person he didn't realize was rare? By now, he begins to understand that silence is not an absence of communication. It is communication. It is clarity. It is a message louder than anything you could have said. It tells him that energy is not owed, attention is not guaranteed, and access is not permanent. He begins to understand that relationships don't fall apart because of silence, they fall apart because the silence reveals truths that were always there. And in those truths, he feels the weight of every moment he hesitated, every effort he didn't make, every chance he wasted. He begins thinking about you not from a place of convenience, but from a place of realization. Realization that you were not waiting for him. Realization that your silence wasn't meant to hurt him, it was meant to heal you. And in that healing, you created a distance he now has to earn his way back across. Day by day, your silence becomes the mirror he didn't ask for but needed. It shows him who he was, who he should have been, and what he risks losing when he takes someone for granted. And through that reflection, he begins to understand something life-changing. Silence isn't empty, it's full of answers. And every answer brings him closer to the truth he can no longer avoid. And as that truth sinks in, he starts to feel something he hasn't felt in a long time. Accountability. Not the surface-level kind he uses to make himself feel mature, but the deeper, quieter kind that forces a man to look at the version of himself he's been presenting to the world. Your silence becomes a catalyst for his self-reflection, shaking him out of the comfort he didn't even realize he was wrapped in. He begins questioning not only what he did with you, but what he's been doing in his life overall. How often he avoids effort, how often he chooses convenience, how often he lets meaningful connections drift because he assumes they will wait for him. Your silence exposes those habits with a clarity he can't escape. He starts to understand why your absence unsettles him so much. It's not just that you're gone, it's that your silence forces him to meet himself without the buffer of your presence. Before, he could distract himself. He could lean on your reassurance, your understanding, your softness. He could assume you would always be the one who cared a little more. But when you step back, he realizes how much he depended on that dynamic, how much he relied on your emotional consistency to make up for his emotional hesitation. And that realization is uncomfortable because it reveals how imbalanced things were without either of you ever saying it out loud. He starts thinking about what your silence means for his own value, not because he's insecure, but because for the first time, he wonders whether he showed up as a man who deserved your energy. He replays moments he brushed off. He rethinks choices he once excused. And he begins to see a pattern, not just with you, but in his life. A pattern of holding back. A pattern of inconsistency. A pattern of wanting the feeling of connection without committing to the responsibility of nurturing it. Your silence highlights those patterns like a spotlight, illuminating every part he usually keeps in the shadows. As days continue to pass, the quiet begins to feel heavy. He no longer tells himself the comforting stories he did on the first day. He stops pretending he doesn't care. The truth becomes undeniable. He misses access to you. He misses your energy. He misses the way you listened, the way you responded, the way you made him feel seen without him ever having to ask for it. He didn't notice those things when he had them, but now they come back to him one by one, each realization cutting through his pride a little more. He may even find himself reaching for his phone, typing a message, then deleting it, not because he doesn't want to talk to you, but because he suddenly feels unsure of his position in your life. Your silence shifts the dynamic in a way he didn't expect. Before, he felt safe knowing you were emotionally available. Now he doesn't know if he still has that place. And that uncertainty makes him hesitate. It makes him think. It forces him to weigh his words, to choose his intentions, to consider how he wants to show up if he does reach out. Your silence teaches him something he's never really had to learn. Access requires effort, presence requires reciprocation, and connection requires participation, not just appreciation. He begins to understand that affection is not something he can simply receive. It's something he has to earn through consistency, clarity, and care. And now, for the first time, he starts to feel the responsibility of that. As more time passes, he becomes even more introspective. He begins to wonder what your silence says about you. He sees strength in it. He sees self-respect. He sees a woman who refuses to settle for someone who gives her half of what she offers. He sees someone choosing peace over confusion, and that realization changes the way he thinks about you entirely. You're no longer the person who made space for him, you're the person who reclaimed her space for herself. And that shift increases his admiration in ways he never expected. He starts asking himself questions he never considered before. Did he make you feel valued? Did he make you feel chosen? Did he give you enough certainty? Did he show up in ways that matched your emotional investment? Those questions linger in his mind long after he tries to distract himself, because your silence didn't create these doubts, it revealed them. It peeled back the layers of the connection and showed him exactly where he fell short. What surprises him most is how much your silence makes him realize about your worth. Not because you demanded anything, but because you removed yourself from the situations that didn't align with you. You didn't explain it, you didn't justify it, you didn't dramatize it. You simply became quiet. And in doing so, you communicated a boundary louder than any confrontation ever could. He realizes that your silence isn't emptiness. It's intention. It's a decision to protect your happiness, your energy, and your peace. He starts to imagine what your life looks like without him in it. He wonders whether you've become lighter, happier, more centered. He wonders if someone else is appreciating the parts of you he overlooked. And those thoughts linger because they're rooted in his deepest fear. The fear of realizing someone valuable slipped away not because of a fight, but because of a lack of effort. That fear wakes him up in the middle of the night. It stays with him when he scrolls through old messages. It follows him when he goes about his day pretending everything is fine. Your silence becomes a presence he can't escape. It becomes a reminder of what he didn't give. It becomes a symbol of the emotional maturity he needs to develop. It becomes the moment where he realizes that connection isn't something he can take for granted. And as that awareness grows, he begins to think about you with a depth he never allowed himself before. He sees your loyalty. He sees your intentions. He sees your softness. He sees your strength. And all the things he once treated casually now feel significant. He may even begin to feel regret. Not dramatic, desperate regret, but the quiet kind that settles in slowly, the kind that whispers to him when he's alone, the kind that makes him rethink everything. Because your silence didn't punish him. It revealed him. It showed him what he stands to lose when he doesn't fully show up for someone who showed up for him. And that is when the shift becomes fully internal. He stops thinking from ego and starts thinking from truth. He stops thinking about what you gave him and begins thinking about who you are. He stops thinking about himself and starts thinking about the connection. He stops thinking based on comfort and starts thinking based on growth. Your silence becomes the emotional wake-up call he didn't know he needed. Day by day, he comes to understand a simple, powerful reality. Silence from a woman who once cared is not empty. It is full of meaning. It signals self-worth. It signals boundaries. It signals emotional clarity. And it signals that she is no longer available to a connection that doesn't elevate her. Your silence becomes the moment he realizes that you are not waiting for him to change. You are evolving with or without him. And as that truth settles in, he begins to understand something he never considered before, that the quietest version of you is often the version that teaches the loudest lesson. And as that lesson forms in his mind, it begins reshaping the way he looks at everything, his choices, his reactions, his patterns, his expectations. He realizes that your silence is not just about what happened between you two, it's about what it represents. It represents a shift in your standards. It represents a new level of self-respect that no longer allows half-hearted effort to feel acceptable. It represents the moment you chose yourself, not out of spite, but out of understanding. And the weight of that understanding lands on him more heavily with each passing day. He begins to notice how strange it feels to go through moments he once wanted to share with you. Something funny happens, and for a second he thinks of telling you, but he has no idea if he still has the right to. Something stressful happens, and he instinctively thinks of your calming presence, but your silence reminds him that he didn't nurture that connection when he had the chance. This shift, from taking your presence for granted to questioning whether he still has access to it, becomes the emotional turning point he can't ignore. Your silence also starts pushing him into emotional territory he usually avoids. It makes him question why he struggled to express things when you were right there, offering space, kindness, and patience. He wonders why vulnerability felt scary when connection felt safe. He wonders why he held back softness when you offered so much warmth. And now that you've stepped away, he begins to see how much fear guided his actions. Fear of commitment, fear of expectations, fear of losing freedom, fear of being seen too deeply. But as he sits with the quiet, he realizes something far more frightening. Losing someone who genuinely cared is a far greater loss than facing his own fears ever was. As the days stack up, he feels the emotional contrast growing sharper. He remembers how effortlessly you made communication feel. You didn't demand attention. You created a space where connection felt natural. You didn't chase him. You invited him. You didn't pressure him. You understood him. But now, without that presence, the ease he once felt is replaced by tension. Tension within himself. Tension that asks him whether he's finally ready to show up the way he always should have. He starts to notice the emotional void your silence creates. Not a dramatic emptiness, but a subtle absence that highlights what he lost. It shows up in quiet moments, in the way he scrolls his phone longer than usual, hoping to see your name, in the way he replays old voice notes or rereads messages, searching for something familiar, in the way he double taps through social media distractedly, hoping something from you appears. He never wanted to be this aware, but silence has a way of sharpening awareness in places where noise once kept him comfortable, and with every moment of reflection, he starts to grasp the deeper truth. Your silence didn't distance you from him. It brought you back to yourself. It brought you back to your center. It brought you back to the version of you that refuses to settle for anything less than mutual effort. And that shift is powerful. Because he begins to see that while he was hesitating, doubting, holding back, you were growing, you were healing, you were rising in your own life. And now the difference between where you stand and where he stands feels wider than ever. He starts to understand something about your silence that he never understood before. It carries dignity. It carries self-control. It carries maturity. It carries an unspoken message that says, I choose my peace over uncertainty. And that realization forces him to confront the emotional laziness he once excused as taking things slow. He sees now that what he called patience on your side was actually investment. What he called not needing labels was actually avoidance. What he called not wanting to rush was actually fear. And your silence reflects those truths back to him with a clarity he can't ignore. As more time passes, he begins to wonder how you're feeling. Not because he's suddenly become deeply empathetic, but because he senses that your silence means you're changing, evolving. He wonders if you've found new priorities, new passions, new strength. He wonders if someone else is appreciating the qualities he didn't nurture. He wonders if you now view him as a closed chapter, a lesson learned, a phase completed. These thoughts create a subtle pressure inside him. Pressure to reflect, pressure to grow. Pressure to confront the emotional gaps he's ignored for too long. He starts to imagine what you must have gone through before you went silent. The confusion, the disappointment, the inner fight between wanting to stay and wanting to protect yourself. And that empathy, however late it arrives, begins to reshape his understanding of the connection. He sees now that your silence wasn't abrupt, it was accumulated. It was built from every moment he hesitated. Every time he sent mixed signals, every opportunity he had to show effort but chose comfort instead. Your silence becomes the final chapter he forced you to write because he didn't offer a better ending. And now, in the middle of his reflection, a new thought emerges, one that carries more weight than all the rest. What if your silence means you no longer need him? Not out of anger, but out of growth. What if you finally realize that the version of love you were offering deserves a partner who meets you with the same clarity, the same warmth, the same consistency? That thought makes him see you differently, not as someone who walked away, but as someone who outgrew the level of connection he was willing to offer. The silence begins to challenge his sense of identity. It forces him to ask himself whether he's been operating on emotional autopilot, whether he's been showing up in relationships with half effort and expecting full presence in return, whether he's been avoiding accountability behind the excuse of being busy or not ready. Your silence strips away those shields and leaves him with the truth. He lost access, not because you were demanding, but because he was complacent. As the days turn into weeks, he begins to recognize something profound. Silence has its own rhythm. It doesn't push. It doesn't pull, it doesn't beg, it simply holds its ground. And that grounded energy becomes something he admires more than anything you ever said because it shows him a level of emotional strength he rarely encounters. It shows him that you don't break, you transform. You don't chase, you align. You don't cling, you release. And in witnessing that transformation from afar, he begins to understand the depth of your value, not because you're unavailable, but because your silence displayed a version of you he never fully appreciated, a version that is self-assured, a version that is centered, a version that knows when to walk away from anything that threatens her peace, a version that refuses to negotiate her worth. Day by day, he starts to realize that silence doesn't erase a connection. It redefines it. It forces him to face what he avoided. It makes him see himself through the lens of the impact he had on someone who genuinely cared. And that awareness becomes a quiet turning point in his life. Because now he understands something that only distance could teach him. Your silence was not emptiness. It was evolution. It was self-protection. It was the moment you chose to rise without waiting for him to rise with you.